Hi, it's Dan, and welcome to another episode of Smuggling Hope. And on today's episode, we're going to be covering what it means to have a marriage 911. When you're at you're at the end of your rope in your marriage, you have nothing left to give. You want to call it quits. You want to walk away. You want to run away, for a variety of reasons. And so this episode is dedicated to all those people who have really been struggling with that experience. And we're going to get into that today. And hopefully you walk away with some hope. Obviously, that is the title of the show. This episode is coming out a little bit later than normal just because I've been a little bit under the weather and just wasn't able to coordinate. If you're watching it on YouTube, you're going to notice my face is swollen. Well, that's just because that's what my allergies do to me. So unfortunately, the makeup director or the makeup and hair person I just can't afford that yet, right? So hopefully I'm just messing around. But so we continue to do this podcast for you all, trying to the intention of this is to provide you the best quality of information and resources for counsel in the community, rooted in the Catholic faith and sacred tradition. And again, the most up-to-date research that we have in behavioral sciences, and we will continue to cover topics related, mental health, family life. Today we're talking about marriage. We've talked about mood. We've talked about different emotional states, issues within the spiritual life. And your feedback continues to make this show possible. Your ideas and your recommendations for guests and topics. I'm trying to give you what you have requested. But before we get into the show, a couple words about those in support of the podcast. Hearts Renewed is an online marriage program designed to give married couples the principles and the best practices to have the most remarkable marriages that they can. That program can be done at home, and it is designed to eradicate all problems and concerns and issues that make it hard for people to access, counseling services, right? So, people, like they say, they can't afford counseling. They say they don't have time. They can't figure out stuff with childcare. They don't trust counselors. They're too embarrassed to go to their priest. Well, over 7 years, I designed this program so that people can, without the professional being present, go through these modules, watch a 5, 10, I think there's one video that's probably beyond 20 minutes, but most of them are 5 to 10 minutes, have a conversation with their spouse and really start to move in a direction that is in many ways, very altering. And I would hope, the feedback has been phenomenal. People who have tried the program right now, you can, go online to heartsrenewed.org. Try the program for $1 if you type in the code renew1. Again, that'll be in the show notes, and you can try the program for $1. Again, if you're not having any issues, maybe you're not married, but you have friends that are married, or you have son-in-laws, daughter-in-laws that are married, you definitely tell them about the program. I don't know why you wouldn't want to try to have the most remarkable marriage that you would want and just spend $1. It's a very low cost thing, for 7 days to try something that might change your whole marriage and your whole family life. So if you can raise awareness of that, check it out. There's a lot of free resources on the page right now. We have stuff about family culture for parents. We have people, getting our intimacy guide, right? How to, improve their friendship and their sexual life in their marriage. So that's been a huge, I think, blessing to people. And again, we have this series that is also there, a webinar on marriage itself for people who have, maybe not been exposed to these ideas. Again, we want to promote hope. We want to promote the dignity and the sacredness of marriage, because it is really the cell of society, right? Our family life, our marital life really forms what happens in society. So Hearts Renewed is, again, out there. The other support of this podcast has come from the Chesterton Academy of Buffalo. Chesterton Academy of Buffalo is a private, high school, a private Catholic high school in the classical tradition. And there are 3 pillars to that formation of their students. They form students intellectually, they form students in their character, and in their spiritual life. And I have 2 students in that school, and one of the reasons why I chose that school, there was a lot of wonderful Catholic schools in Buffalo. This is where this podcast is. This is where I live. There's a lot of Catholic schools, high schools, but I wanted my children to have a different experience of high school where they are learning how to think. Now, if you think about school in general, the goal of school education right now is in flux. People have not agreed upon what the point of school is. I've actually been thrown out of board meetings in schools because they could not answer the question, what is school for? But if you look at school, I'll tell you what I think the majority of schools operate by making people a consumer. So, for instance, you go to school to get good grades. You get good grades in high school so you can get into a good college. You get into a good college so that at some point you can get a good job. And you get a good job so you can buy stuff. So the end of education is really about teaching people how to be better consumers. So whether or not you graduate high school and you become a janitor, or you go all the way through medical school and you become a surgeon, you may never really learn how to think. You just learn how to acquire more stuff. And I wanted my children to have the ability to think. And that school has done a remarkable job with my children, forming them with both the values, but also the ability to think and to develop their character along the way, and to produce relationships in a Catholic cultural environment. So you can check out the local school at Chesterton Academy of Buffalo.org, or you can look for your own Chesterton school or start your own Chesterton school by going to chestertonschoolnetwork.org. And again, I think people want to maybe check that out, or if you want to bring a school to your neck of the woods, if you don't already have one, might be worth looking at, right? So they're popping up. Classical education is coming back, especially as mainstream education seems to be falling apart. The educational system seems like it's falling apart. And if people are listening to this and they're teachers, maybe they're upset by that, but sadly, it's a very difficult time in all forms of education. So I'll leave it at that. But those are the two big supports of this podcast. If you want to support this podcast, one way that you can do that is to click on the subscribe link if you're watching us on YouTube, or you can go on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or I don't know if I'm still on Amazon. I have no idea. They keep changing their stuff. But just to subscribe. And if you find that the podcast is worth giving 5 stars, please do. And let people know that it exists. The biggest issue that we have with all of these things and materials and information is it really has to be famous to a few. A few people have to care and talk about it and share it with people, bring it to their attention of their priests, bring it to their attention of the people that are in their school, their community, their family, so these ideas get to the people they need to get to. Because again, the more hope goes up, the more people know what works in these different areas, the more we really can improve the general situation that we're all experiencing, both in our microcosm of our families and in the world, because we all kind of belong to each other, as Mother Teresa said, right? Everybody belongs to each other. So what I do, what I fail to do affects you, even if we never physically meet. What happens in my home will affect you, even if we don't necessarily physically meet, right? So again, thank you for your continued support and encouragement of the podcast. And but again, in the show notes, I will put a link to both the dollar offer for the Hearts Renewed program, and also the link to the Chesterton schools for those interested. Okay, so on with the show. So today we're talking about marriage 911. What happens when people are at the end of the rope for their marriage? Now, this is a unique thing, because you'd think, that this it wouldn't happen, especially with people who are religious, or it wouldn't happen with people of faith. But the truth is that in a lot of ways, marriage is very, very hard. And I was listening to an attorney talk the one time, a divorce attorney, and he was saying that people fall out of love the way that people go bankrupt. It's little by little, and then it seems like it's all at once, right? And so for a lot of people, it's not like this giant sweeping movement into despair or helplessness in their marriage. It's incremental, death by 1,000 paper cuts, and then they just want to get away. They want to get out. And there's a lot of things that put pressure on people's marriages, and there's a lot of things that obviously can disrupt marriage. But today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what are the things you can do if you are at that low point, that place where you don't know why, but you feel like you almost have to leave your marriage. And so the first thing I want to address is like the elephant in the room, which is that divorce is a business. Okay. It is a business, and it is a business supported by your media, right? Your media your media on your phone, your media on YouTube, your media, even a lot of the gurus on social media and YouTube. I see these all the time. They're incendiary, right? There's incendiary content that tells people to be angry and to leave their relationships. Everything about their Instagram feed tells you that you should be wanting something other than the marriage or relationship you're in, that your home isn't as nice, your children aren't as wonderful, your husband or your wife, there's something wrong. There's something wrong with everything. And a lot of people forget at the core, there is a business, right? A business. People make tons and tons of money off of divorce, okay? And no matter how virtuous or how kind or how considerate your divorce attorney will be, if you choose to go down that road, that is a dog in a fight, and they are being paid to essentially get your assets and obtain like what it is that they can obtain from the marital union you had. And so sometimes people come to me and they'll be like, well, I know divorce because I work with primarily Catholic people, and they'll be like, well, I know divorce is something that God doesn't like. Well, this is kind of a weird thing, is this idea, like divorce is really, like as Jesus says, I think even in the Gospels, is that this is something that we've generated. When God connects people, people are bound. You know what the judge says, what attorneys say, what it says on your receipt after you submit all these claims and do all this stuff. That's human stuff. Marriage is a sacrament, and so sacraments and things that are connected to God and to people in a spiritual way, that just doesn't end with, it just doesn't end with a couple signatures of paperwork. It doesn't end once you find another relationship, right? You're in another relationship. Well, you could be in multiple types of new relationships. People get married 2, 3, 4 times. I think people need to understand, if they are at the end of the rope, that about 85% of people who report being divorced and then remarried are really no happier in their second, third, fourth marriage than they were in their original marriage. And many people are around divorced people all the time that are remarried. And they're like, well, I know this person, and this person was in a terrible marriage, and now they're remarried, and now they're having the best life ever, or they're dating everybody. Understand that in the rank of traumatic events in a human being's life, the most traumatic event on most studies is the death of a child. Then the second most traumatic event for a person is a divorce. Because your brain has a story where it's, so for me, in my example, like would be, I have me and my wife, and we have 7 children, right? And so every day my brain, not just me, but my actual brain has wired a story about what to expect, who I'm going to see, this person, right? And that story, every dimension of my life, my future and my past, for over 20 years now, is connected to my wife in her presence. So if for whatever reason I get to a place where things are so bad, what I'm doing is I'm taking a whole neurological structure of my brain. Okay, we're not even talking about the spiritual, psychological dimension yet. We're talking about the neurological component. My brain has a story bound up with this woman, these children. For me to separate myself from that story is not possible. What it does is it actually produces a sense of, so if I separate myself from that person, I literally activate the sensation of desire, perpetual desire and grief, because my brain is looking for this person that I had a projected future with. It's one thing if there's a breakup and a heartbreak, right? Because many of us have fallen in love and there's heartbreak. But when you have a marital contract where the contract states we're never leaving each other, and now we're leaving each other, my brain falls into panic, and that doesn't just go away. This is a very tragic experience. And so why is this being promoted? Well, we could have a whole other podcast about why this is promoted, but essentially the no-fault divorce movement, all of this stuff pretty much has to do with the destruction of the family and the movement towards this, for people to be weaker and to people to be confused, and then for people to be more submissive to their government. Essentially, that's it. And again, it's beyond the scope of this podcast, but because people are like, well, why would they promote this? Well, frankly, that's why. But if people are thinking about divorce, they have to understand they're going to damage their brain and their brain's ability to function very well. Not to mention, you're going to be paying tens of thousands of dollars. You're going to financially wreck yourself. If you can handle the financial wreckage, which most people can't, nobody really wins on this except for the attorneys, right? And most of the attorneys don't find family court very pleasant. Your judge doesn't make more money by hearing your case. I mean, it's a quite miserable experience, for the legal professionals. Sorry, I gotta, my eyes bother me today. These allergies, right? So if I take too many allergy medications, I'm going to be quite either sedated or pumped up on this, and goodness, that's probably not a good idea. So I want you to understand this whole movement of, well, God, it's not a concept that God has created. Remember, before there was institutions of marriage or the sacrament of marriage as we know it in the Catholic Church, marriage was a physical union of sex between man and woman, sexual union, right? And so, again, that's why it's the primordial sacrament. That's why sex is so sacred in Catholicism. It's not because we're rule mongers, it's because it's the primordial sacrament. And because when we are connecting with people through the use of our bodies in sexual union, it is to be permanently done, like in terms of it's a permanent bondage. But if people are doing this, and again, we've separated marriage from sex, now we've disrupted the ability for us to actually understand what marriage is and how it works. And so many people, I think, find marriage to be a place of self-indulgence. They think that they're going to come to marriage, and I hear a lot of times in my own practice, people be like, well, I'm just not getting what I want from the marriage. Well, the marriage is not like some well that you come to drink at and be fulfilled. Like, it's not, it is something that you have to empty yourself into. It's a sacrificial experience and a place of sacrifice. And in a world that tells you you don't need to sacrifice, we are really not wired. At least we're not. I shouldn't say we're not very. We're programmed to, in many ways, be very frustrated once we get into marriage and what it actually is, because it really is a sacrificial experience, and that's what makes it life-giving, and that's what makes it fulfilling. There is no life-giving quality to selfishness. Selfishness destroys you. Selfishness will corrupt you. Selfishness will make your life miserable. You'll find that the more you think about yourself, the more afraid you become, and the more afraid you become, the more depressed you get, and the faster your life goes. And again, that is not what God wants for people. So when people get to a place where they are, at the end of the rope in marriage, it's for a variety of reasons. I mean, it could be, and again, we could go on, but usually it didn't just happen overnight. Okay, it's usually a steady progression, and usually people have tried things. They've gone to counseling. Again, some people have not. I find people of faith to be hesitant to go to counseling for good reason. Your marriage really is a very personal thing, and you really don't want everybody and their mother being involved with it. One of the reasons why I started and designed that Hearts Renewed program is what is very, I guess, what I was always trained at and what I've seen in the research is you really don't want the therapist person, the counselor person, the psychologist person, whoever you're working with for your couples work. You don't want that professional overly involved in your marriage, for long periods of time. What does that mean? Well, that could be different for everybody, again. But and if they are working with you, there needs to be an identified goal that is really trying to be promoted at the front. And that's why that program is designed the way that it is, so that, you have the privacy. And some people, again, they don't believe that they're going to get benefit from a professional. They want to do the work on their own, which, hey, that's what the program's for. There will always be people that will seek out a professional, which is also great. That's kind of like why I do what I do. At the same time, though, I don't want to be, the third person in your marriage should be God. It should not be a professional. And you don't want like some weird, it's like Uncle Joe is here. No, it's not. It shouldn't be like a third party always being involved in your marriage. So if if your marriage, you're at your end of your rope, the first thing you want to remember is stop perpetuating what doesn't work. So in your effort to solve your problem in your marriage, again, and there's a lot of reasons why this is going to happen, in your effort to solve the marriage problems, you're going to maybe actually make things worse, because every time you try to solve a problem and it doesn't end up successful, your confidence goes down. Now, many people from the jump, they're thinking that they can control the other person, manipulate the other person, get the other person to change. They hope the other person would change. They hope they would have stopped drinking, overspending. They thought that their in-laws would have magically changed since they're married. They thought that having another kid would make things better. So a lot of times, like, we're perpetuating in things that don't work. And so what I suggest that you do if you're at the end of your rope is all of the things that your spouse is doing that upset you, all of those things that your spouse is doing that upset you, stop talking about them. Stop giving them attention. Unless, this is the unless it's a safety issue, right? So if they're for whatever reason driving around with, a pint of liquor and driving your kids to soccer practice, if they're drinking and driving, if they're threatening to kill themselves, whatever. If it's a safety issue, intervene. But in general, if they're just a curmudgeon, if they watch too much sports, if they don't pick up their socks, if they were late coming home from work, if your wife didn't kiss you hello, what you don't need to keep promoting what you hate. Again, one of the big things that people say, I mean, it's a lot of I guess it's my mantra, or it had been my mantra for a long time, is whatever you focus on gets bigger. And in the pursuit of problem solving, problems seem to almost overtake the marriage. And, people are like, oh, everything's wrong in my marriage. No, it's that one of these things that you don't like, or things oftentimes that you don't control, have taken over your attention. And what you give attention to, you give life to. And now you're losing sight of the person you are, the person your spouse is, and you're really upset. And the more upset you are, the more easily influenced you are, right? So now you want validation, but you can't get it from your spouse. And so now you go online and you go on some YouTube channel that tells you that your husband's a narcissist, or your wife's playing sex games and she's withholding sex from you and you should divorce her. It doesn't matter, because, again, they want likes, they want clicks. Nobody is advertising or even interested in, most of the time, the truth. They just want to promote content that will make you watch things. They don't care if your marriage succeeds. Everybody makes more money if you click more and divorce more, because we can sell more things to vulnerable people, right? So, I mean, that's why it's so hard for my material to become viral, I guess. Maybe it's a good thing. I guess if my material upset people, I guess it wouldn't spread, huh? Well, I'm sorry, it would probably spread faster if it upset people. So stop giving attention to the things that aren't working, right? Stop paying attention to the things that aren't working. Don't keep talking about them, and instead keep a list. If you're a spouse, keep a list of all of the things that your spouse is doing that are things that you want to see continue. It could be small things like your wife is doing your laundry, or your husband still takes the kids to soccer, or whatever the case might be. Your husband's still going to work, or your wife's still going to work, or you're glad that, like, your husband gave the kids a bath yesterday. I don't know. But you want to give attention to the signs of life in your marriage, because you need to direct your attention towards that. And that helps the mind relax. It also helps you to engage a different pattern that's there. There's always a pattern of success. Although oftentimes it is not the one that your brain pays attention to, because your brain is designed to see problems and to solve them. So the more things that, like I said, the more things that are upsetting, the more that gets your attention. And that's why, again, if you check out the program that we designed for Hearts Renewed, you're going to see how to bypass a lot of this more in depth than on the podcast. But it will greatly enhance your ability to build up confidence and turn off this negative pattern finding, right? This negative GPS. It's almost like, oh, let's find out why I should hate my spouse today. Not a great use of time. Okay, so if you're at the end of your ropes, stop paying. Give the attention to the signs of life. Okay. The second thing is that if you didn't listen to the podcast, I think maybe it was last week or the week before, we were talking about making our spouse our God. A lot of times this is because we have made our spouse our God. We have to get to a place where instead we are building a sphere of self-reinforcement. That means that we have a list of behaviors and things that we can do, and those things give us confidence because they reinforce the person we want to be at the end of our life. And so I am measuring what I can control. So stop focusing on your husband or wife's behavior. Start focusing on what you can do. So let's say, for instance, your wife is carrying on an affair and it was discovered, and she told you, well, you know what? I don't want to stop the affair. And this is enraging to the husband. Okay, well, you can't control your wife. Maybe when she leaves, she goes off and goes on a date with this other guy. You're going to keep falling to pieces. And I know people hear this and they're like, oh, this is people's lives. This is what happens in people's lives, right? So don't be shocked by it. If you're shocked by it, just be grateful to God it's not your life, and pray for people, because this is people's lives. But that husband then needs to think about, well, the man I want to be, what are the things that I do that are both good for me? If there are children, good for my children. And what are the things that the man I want to be does, right, that is loving towards his spouse, even though she's actively working against the marriage in terms of she's not committed, at least in one way, she's not at this point committed to being present to the marriage. She's still involved in this affair. And those behaviors that he can maintain and he can show up to, he can keep a holy hour, he can pray the rosary, he can go to the gym, he can take his kids to soccer practice, he can, read a book that's good for him, whether it's about relationships or about spiritual things or about his career. He can decide to go out for a promotion. He can decide to ask his wife out on a date. Remember, he can only control what he does. Remember, there's only 4 controllables: what you say, what you do, your perspective, and your attitude. What you say, what you do, your perspective, and your attitude. Those are the only 4 things you control in your life. You don't control how you feel. You don't control how you think. You certainly don't control what other people think or how other people feel. And you can analyze that statement and replay it. But those are really the only 4 controllables. And so that man, in this situation, in this example, like, he has to measure what he can control. And his confidence then comes from getting back on track with the man he wants to be. This also changes, and it would have a side effect with this woman if she's carrying on an affair. And again, we've done podcasts on affairs. You can check that out. I think it's, The State of Affairs is the title of the podcast. It's from last year, I think. If you're interested or people are dealing with this stuff. But, confidence then obviously is coming from the person I want to be and from the place that I can manifest. And I'm not necessarily going to, if I'm the man, I'm not going to be chasing after this woman, as terrible and torturesome as this is, because, my confidence can't be dependent on her. Now, she's also going to see that if she comes back from these dates or she comes back home to see her husband is evolving. Her husband is evolving even if she's not there. And both men and women want novelty in different ways in their marriage. And that's actually a big reason why affairs sometimes happens, is that men and women especially, want to see men's ambition, their desire to sacrifice for their family, their desire to evolve, continue. And same thing for men. They want to see their wives evolve as a woman, right? And women should become more attractive, and men should become more sacrificial. And when I say attractive, I do not mean sexual or physical only in attractiveness. I mean that they should want to draw more and more of the world into the home, and be more relaxed. Women become more attractive when they're relaxed, right? And in terms of their force of attraction. When women are tense and scared or afraid, they repel, right? They repel oftentimes, or they become very submissive to the wrong types of people. And again, that's a whole other podcast. So what we want to we want to measure what we can control, create a sphere of self-reinforcement. If I was to give you a different example, I would say, well, maybe there's a woman and her husband's addicted to pornography and he doesn't want to stop, or he's an alcoholic and he just doesn't want to stop, right? Or whatever the case is, or he plays video games and he doesn't care about the marriage. He just wants to be Peter Pan forever. Whatever his bad behaviors are, well, the woman cannot. She could say all types of things. She could give an ultimatum and say, if you do this one more time, we're through. Well, again, what that does is it puts a lot of power away from you. So ultimatums, this is the thing a lot of people don't understand. An ultimatum, what it does is it actually removes power from you without you knowing it. It says, I'm going to have to do this if you do this. And so all of a sudden, it's kind of like, I don't have any power left. I don't have any power because now I have to do this behavior or I'm immediately weaker. So if you give an ultimatum, it may seem like common sense. You have to be aware of the fact that you're actually getting rid of your power. There's always options. There's never just one way to do things. And I think that that's too reductionist maybe sometimes for us to be, but people are very big into give them an ultimatum. Well, it depends on what the goal is. If you want to get rid of somebody, you can get rid of somebody. You don't need to give them an ultimatum. You can just leave. You don't have to tell them and threaten them. Threatening them gives them your power, and then they are either going to bully you or they're going to, maybe they will change, but that's still going to be a terrifying experience because it all rests on them now. So you have to be okay with the ultimatums you give because, there's no guarantee that you're going to get that power back at all. And so I find that I discourage people oftentimes from ultimatums for that reason, because I don't want them to empty themselves of their decision-making ability, because it's like you make all of your decisions all at once. And then you say, you've got to do this, and if you don't, I'm done. So in the case of the woman whose husband is doing all this other stuff, again, she's not. The more you focus on why are you drinking, why are you looking at this, why don't you come, all of this stuff, we're going to get more of what we hate. So the woman has to think about, who do I want to be at the end of my life? Who do I want to be at the end of my life? And that woman, would she be proud of? What should she be doing? So that sphere of self-reinforcement has to happen now. Well, the woman I want to be, well, she spends time with her family. She, exercises. She goes to adoration. She, whatever it is. She volunteers. She does whatever. And what this does, again, is it helps the spouse to build confidence. You have to have a source of confidence that is not connected to your spouse's behavior. If your spouse's behavior is upsetting, because you cannot control the other person's behavior. And so from this dynamic, you have, for most people, you either have somebody's aggressive and somebody's avoidant, right? The husband is avoidant. He doesn't want conflict with his wife. He's afraid of being rejected from his wife. He's afraid of getting yelled at by his wife. So his wife says a need. Maybe she says it quietly. He hears criticism. She gets louder and louder and louder. And now she's yelling at him, or it seems like it's yelling at him. And he gets deafer and goes away, goes to the garage and has a beer. And now she's yelling at him. And now he eventually yells at her. It's just a terrible pattern where the man is not engaged or the woman is aggressive. In general, men should be the ones, being more active, right? The pattern is that men need to take action. And in many ways, women have to be able to express their needs, because that is how women solve their problems, is through articulation, right? Men and women are fascinating, because when I talk, I say what I mean. When my wife speaks, my wife says what she feels, at least first. She says what she feels. And as a man, if you hear what a woman feels, you interpret it as that's what she thinks, but that's not correct. And so men get very frustrated sometimes with their wives, or they get very scared, or they get very hurt. And we can become, as men, very childish or very overly sensitive. And it can go the same way. Women can feel very hurt and dismissed by their husbands. But you got to remember, men, again, when I say things, I say what I think. Oftentimes, I don't even know how I feel. My wife might be able to pick up on that faster than me. But my wife is always going to start by articulating how she feels, because that is the way that the brain organizes information. So men and women organize information and communicate it very differently. So you got to be patient with each other, right? And so, but in order to be patient, in order to hold space, in order to kind of get to a place where you can be present again with your spouse, you have to feel safe and stable, in the sense that you're measuring what you can control. Because as soon as you start measuring what you can't control, as soon as you start worrying about, oh my gosh, is she coming back? Oh my gosh, is she talking to that guy? Oh my gosh, he went downstairs, but is he drinking again? Is he looking at porn again? All of a sudden, you are not going to be able to feel stable. You're going to feel all types of upset, and you're going to then reactivate the pattern that probably brought you to the end of your rope. So that's important. Get that that logic of appropriateness, as I've talked about prior, that sphere of self-reinforcement. Decide who you want to be. Get back on track with who you want to be, because the marriage is made up of two people, and those people have to be you have to be aware of who those people are, because you didn't just disappear when you got married. You didn't disappear. Because you have to collect yourself, and you have to put yourself into the marriage and offer yourself up. But you want to reinstate. You have to have the confidence to show up to the marriage. So that's another key. The other thing is, if you're at the end of the rope of your marriage and you're really having a difficult time, when we are struggling in our relationship and we do not feel validated, and oftentimes this is the case for men and women. Both men and women complain and gossip about their spouses at times. I've had many, and I don't know if this is a normative thing. This is definitely not healthy, and it should not be normal. But I've had many people come into the office and say, "Well, you just talk negative. I just talk negatively about my husband," right? Particularly women, because again, women solve relational problems. A byproduct of solving relational problems is women have higher levels, on average, of negative emotion, right? It doesn't mean that men don't have negative emotion, but women carry a high level of negative emotion because they are attuned to relationships. And so if they have negative emotions, sometimes they share that negative emotion places they maybe don't. And because if they don't get validated from their husband, they say it to their mother, or they tell their friend at work, or they tell their sister, or, and if that happens, obviously that starts to erode the intimacy of the relationship. So we want to even though we might be suffering, if it's a man complaining about his wife, you really don't want to speak negative about your spouse outside of your marriage ever, ever. If you're doing that, it is not normative. Because again, this is your primary relationship. This is the person that you've betrothed, that you profess that you want to love forever. Mock that person, to complain about that person, to deride that person is to destroy yourself. Because this is your relationship. So if you're around people and they are gossiping about their spouse, do not participate in it. And when the time is right, you may even want to, encourage them to reflect on why they're doing this, because it displays a high level of desperation and a low level of confidence, because you want to be promoting and upholding your spouse. Your wife should be the most attractive person in your life, right, to you. And she should be the best person that you know, right? Your husband should be like one of the people that you, I would hope, admire, right? Because both men and women in their marriages, we all have doubt. Like my wife, I'm sure, has doubts at times. I have doubts at times. The last thing that I want to hear about is that you've said negative things about me to somebody outside of our marriage, because what that does is it makes me feel less close, right? It also scares me. It makes me wonder what other information I don't know, and it makes me more anxious. And right, so then if I'm not open, if I'm tense, I'm not going to be as receptive. And we need to be receptive in communication. If we're going to improve the marriage, we have to get both people to relax. So imagine that I'm in my office today. So in my office, I have one window, right? So in your marriage, you really are in a room where you really should have no windows, right? You should have no windows. There should be nobody else that knows what goes on in your marriage except you and your wife, or you and your husband. Not your mom, not your dad, not a coworker. As soon as you leave the marriage and you start talking about, so let's say, for instance, instead of me bringing up a problem with my wife that I have, I talk to my brother-in-law. Or instead of talking to my wife about a problem that I have within the marriage or something I need from her, I go to my daughter or I go to my son. What I do is I leave the office, I leave the little room, and I go outside and I create a window. My wife stays in this room by herself, but now me and my daughter, or me and my son, or me and my brother-in-law, or whatever, look at my wife from outside, right? And we do not want people looking in on our relationships, right? Because again, there's also a burden to this disclosure, right? My daughter now needs to know, and she's going to feel anxious about our marriage and the state. She can't have a normal childhood now because she knows too much about these things. It is not her responsibility to meet my needs as a husband. It is not my brother-in-law's responsibility, or a friend or a coworker's responsibility to meet those needs. And this is how emotional affairs happen, or codependent relationships happen with parents and children, is we start taking the needs outside of the marriage. So close all the windows and doors, except for the people that are confidential individuals that have your goals in mind. If you have a confidential relationship with a priest, a minister, a counselor, a couples therapist, whatever, that person's job is to help you with your marriage. This is important. Please understand, your attorney is not going to help you with your marriage 99% of the time. Their job is to solve a problem and to maintain your assets. Now, you can talk to a mediator, but you have to be clear about what your goal is. Again, that's why these things can work. The priest can work as long as he's objective and loves you both. The counselor can work as long as they are objective and have an understanding of your goal and will work towards the end, in terms of helping you build the relationship that you want. If you operate with people that are, if you're going to let somebody into your relationship, you have to ensure that that person is a person that has hope for marriage, and you want to assess off the bat, like, how are they functioning? Because so in my field, like, right, we do couples work. I do a lot of couples work. That means I have to make sure that I try to keep an orderly house myself. If I don't, right, so if my life is going to hell and I'm fighting with my wife, or we've got all these marital problems, we got all these other issues, which again, this happens. Then what's going to happen, though, is when I go to work to be present with other people, yes, I'm going to be distracted, but I'm also going to have blind spots. I'm not going to be able to speak the truth because I'm not engaged with the truth in my own life. So this is why, like, therapy work is so weird. And yes, there are people that have horrible marriages, right? I think the level of divorce in my field is higher than the average because we're dealing with really negative emotions, and well, there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm not going to get into like why therapists have terrible relationships oftentimes in marriages, but our divorce rate is far higher than it should be. So you got to be careful. If you're going to let people in, do they like you and your spouse? Do they care about marriage, or do they not care about it? If you're going to see a couples therapist and that couples therapist has already been divorced and they've gotten divorced and they're jaded, again, there's nothing wrong working with someone who's divorced if they have made sense of the experience and they're integrated and they can be present to you. But if they're going through divorce or they're actively cheating on their spouse or whatever's going on, they're going to have blind spots. So be careful about the people that are going to help you. If you're going to bring people in, they need to be people that don't have a lot of blind spots or are able to be transparent about the struggles they've been through. Because everybody in my field, we're either coming from an experience or running from an experience. And if we're coming from an experience, it's a lot better. If you're running from an experience, you're going to miss things. And your marriage is too important. Put in the hands of people who might not be necessarily present. You're not probably going to want to work with a surgeon who's going to do open heart surgery with you. If he, has been really struggling with drinking, and everybody in the unit knows that after work he gets popped, and sometimes he doesn't show up, and they're looking at firing him. Well, you don't know that because you're just a patient. But if you knew that, would you really want to have that person? So it's the same thing. If a person is gone through a divorce, right, you have every right as the client to ask the therapist, what do you think about marriage? If you're Catholic, what do you think about the ideas of the Catholic Church in marriage? What do you believe? And again, if they can't answer those questions, or they get defensive, or they say, well, we're here to talk about you, or well, that's not relevant, fire them and find somebody else. Because that's just that. If it matters to you, it's got to matter to them. If it doesn't matter to them, well, then how are they going to show up the way you need them to? And again, it doesn't mean that everybody has to believe everything, but you have to feel like that person can help you. That's the core thing. So close all the windows to the outside, except for the people who are going to be confidential resources to you and your spouse, and make sure that's helpful for you. And again, for men and women, like, we do need support. You are going to still need support, but you do not need to talk about your marriage or the intricacies of your marriage. Also, if you tell your friends or family, like, let's say, like, again, your spouse is having an addiction, your spouse is having a divorce or an affair, and you tell your parents, well, now your parents know this, and if things improve, now you have to deal with the fact that you've shifted and changed your spouse's identity with other people, not just you, but you've actually spread this to other people. And if now you and your spouse are on good terms, it doesn't mean that your dad or your mom or your friend isn't going to try to, like, bring this up at another time, because there's a weight to this disclosure. It changes the way we view people. So be mindful of that. If you've already done that, again, stop it. Tell people that it was wrong. Tell people you don't want to talk about it anymore. When they bring it up, they're like, oh, because people love, like I said, like, look at this on TikTok, look at this on Instagram. People love to talk about terrible things because the brain really does believe that it is interesting. Because if we see problems, we think we're doing something, and we think that we can stop them by just focusing on them. So you don't need to talk about everything. And people are going to want to talk about negative stuff. That's why gossip is a problem. So these are some of the things that I guess are really important. Getting that sphere of self-reinforcement, closing up all the windows, close up all of the windows, rebuild your confidence, really start to draw away your attention from that pattern of negative interaction, right? And start giving attention to the things that you do want. And the other thing is, if you're a Catholic person, I would encourage you to go to confession immediately and refer. And this is the thing I always tell couples, if I see them even one time, is go to confession and confess that you resent your spouse. Resentment means that you re-feel things, right? You re-feel the hurt. You re-feel, and this could happen, again, like, you can resent your spouse at any time. As soon as you feel that, though, you need to confess it, because it limits your ability to love them. Because you prefer your opinion of them, you prefer, your anger towards them and it will dilute the ability for you to choose to love your spouse. Remember, like, there's large confusion over marriage. People think that they can escape their marriage. And if you're really married to your spouse in the eyes of God, not Again, if you were there fully married to your spouse in the eyes of God, well, God will give you the grace to endure things that most people would think are insane. But that's how we manifest God's mercy in the world. That's why marriage reflects God. Marriage isn't about Sally and John. Marriage is about God. Catholic marriage is about God. So that's why it's a sacrament. It's a sacramental experience. It's not for the individuals. That's why like he permits difficulties. And so go to confession. I would say that's super important if you're on the end of your rope in one way. You also need to increase your relationship with God. So a lot of times, same thing with priesthood, religious life, and the sacrament of marriage. I'll ask people, and I don't ask it as often anymore because I got tired of the answer because the answer was almost cliche. People come in and they're on the verge of divorce and they want to end their marriage or they want to leave the priesthood or they want to do. And the question is, like, what's your prayer life like? And it just doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. And so instead of going to God, people rely on themselves or they would like to find any other way, right? They're going to find they're going to go to YouTube and find some guru who's going to either save their marriage or what they do 90% of the time is tell them or justify why they hate their spouse or why they should leave or why they should demand more things. But why are people not praying? And why are we people not praying for their spouse? So if you are in a place where you have the freedom, right, for whatever reason, maybe you need freedom, you can start by praying as small as you can, seeking out a relationship with God, because there's no consolation in this world outside of Jesus Christ. You're not going to get consolation from your husband or your wife. So maybe they'll stop the affair and they'll stop their addiction, they'll get sober. You're always going to have suffering. But the suffering, and this is the interesting thing, the suffering is always permitted so that you can really seek out and depend on God, so that you do not depend on yourself. As I've said on this episode, on this podcast multiple times, you go to hell to the degree you go to yourself, and you go to heaven the degree you go to Jesus Christ. So every setback that you experience in your marriage should be, under the right context of your understanding, an opportunity for you to fly to Jesus Christ and say, I need your help. I don't know how to deal with this. Whether it's having a child with a disability, or it's discovering your wife is having an affair, whether it's seeing that your husband's drinking is out of control, whether it's you got financial ruin or some tragedy hits your family. We cannot you don't jump ship. You cannot escape this life, and you can forget your identity, but you cannot forget your responsibility. And so just because like you leave, right? I mean, many years ago, I met a person who ran away from their family, right? This woman ran away from her family. She abandoned them all. She had, I think, I don't know, 5 or 6 children, and she abandoned them all. She just left them all. And it haunted her. I mean, I don't think she never went back, and I don't necessarily know what the cause of that was, but it haunted her and it bothered her and took her a very long time to seek out first forgiveness from God and then from herself, and then to start to repair those relationships after, I don't know, over a decade of really abandoning her family. But she could not escape this. You cannot escape the responsibility. You're going to still have ties to these realities. And again, like I explained in the beginning, neurologically, there is that component. And so, you build a story with a person, you just can't get rid of that story. Now, again, like people want the permission to divorce. They ask Jesus, well, what must I do to get a bill of divorce? And Jesus said to them, well, God permitted it because your hearts were hard. God permitted Moses a bill of divorce, right? He permitted the Hebrew people, the Jewish people to have divorce because, gave it to Moses because their hearts were hard. And I think that, again, like if our hearts are not hard, right? And our hearts do not have to be hard if we have a relationship with God. And again, if you want to go even deeper into some of the topics from today, check out the episode that I did about bringing mercy home. That's an episode on the podcast about bringing mercy into our relationship, into our family, and we've talked about forgiveness. But again, like if you're at the end of your rope, stop doing what's not working. Close the doors. Build up your confidence. As confidence goes up, you're going to be able to see more of the person that you fell in love with. Not necessarily your spouse immediately, but who you are. Because if you've become somebody you don't like because of your marriage, or you think it's because of him or her, it's not. It's because there's certain things you've stopped doing, probably because you're too kind. You've given too much. You've been working so hard, dedicated to your children so much that you forgot that you're an actual person. And the resentments don't stop if you aren't honest. So the last thing that I want you to think about at the core of a lot of this is learning to be honest, learning to communicate honestly. And for people who are at the end of their marital rope after you've gone to confession or you've done some of these other things, start writing. Start writing what you feel and what you need, because that writing will at least get this stuff out. And you won't have to worry about dumping it on a child, dumping it on somebody that you shouldn't outside of your marriage. But you need to get this stuff. For many of us, we need to get this stuff out, because human beings are storytellers. And if you have this painful story and you can't tell anyone, you're going to have problems. And you're going to end up getting into trouble, so to speak. It's super important that we, learn a way to communicate these things. Now, and you may not be a writer, right? You may not be a writer. And so for some people, if you're not a writer, you have to be careful about what you read or the shows you watch, right? Because if you fill your mind up with things that make you hate your spouse or hate yourself or hate your life, and again, the media is making money. It's all about being a consumer, consuming the human family, consuming your relationships. YouTube doesn't care. The algorithms don't care about your children if they're well adjusted. They don't care if your marriage succeeds. They don't care if you go broke. Um, they don't care about anything. They just want you to click and stay on engaged and to feel justified, right? And again, if you're not going to write about these experiences, look for stories of hope, of other people who have experienced difficulties but overcame them in their marriage. Look for other podcasts and other things out there that foster hope in conversations, or couples that have gone to hell and back. You're going to find that one of the common themes about all of those couples, I'm not saying that they're all the same by any stretch, because they're all very different, is that what they do is they all turn towards God. Maybe they don't use God in the language, but they all turn to something outside of themselves. And it's not to a person, towards like an affair, but towards Christ, towards God. And they stop competing with each other. They stop trying to win. And they really do get to a place of interior freedom. And the freedom comes really by, detaching and letting go of these really intense expectations and hurts and slights, and realizing what they can and cannot control, and really encountering fears that have long been there, right? And so for you, if you are listening to this and you're at the end of your rope with your marriage, really be honest with yourself, and if you can, get to an adoration chapel and reflect on this, or get to someplace quiet, and think about what you're actually afraid of. Think about what you're afraid of. Is it that you're afraid of, being broke? Is it that you're afraid that you'll never be in love again? Is it afraid that your wife's going to leave you? Is it that you're afraid that your children are going to have a bad childhood because your husband's an alcoholic? You need to see the fears, and you have to understand that God has already overcome all of this. And you do not want fear to be your counsel, right? Fears are bad counsel. So you need to kind of go, again, you have to go to where the power is. And your spouse should not be God. Your money should not be God. This other person, if there's an affair, this other person should not be your God. But it's important that we start to improve upon our confidence and create intimacy again, regain that, and that we not give more attention to these patterns of calamity in our marriage, and instead start looking for God in our midst, start seeing the good in our spouse because they're still there, and realizing that oftentimes, these experiences do happen. Now, I want to talk one last thing before I get off this episode, is that there are people, you will be in situations where you will love your spouse. And this is something that comes across my desk, is people love their spouse. They do all of the things that I just talked about, but their spouse continues to pull away and destroy the relationship. Whatever I talked about, they still willfully leave the marriage, and they're angry and they blame their spouse for why they're doing things like, I have to divorce you, I have to leave you. If you're blaming the other person, always remember, if they're blaming you or if you're blaming them, whoever's projecting the blame, again, they're losing their power. They're saying, I'm not in charge. I'm not responsible. And like I said, if you're removing responsibility, you're actually, it's kind of like Jesus says, you have to carry your cross. You're saying, I don't want to carry this cross. But you know what happens? Is God gives you a heavier cross every single time. So if you're blaming your ex, if you're blaming your spouse and you're like, well, he did this for 10 years and now I'm done with him. Or she's doing this and I'm done with her. Remember, like, if that person refuses, you're loving them, you're offering forgiveness, you're loving them, you're willing to go to counseling, you're willing to do whatever, you're going to confession, but the spouse just keeps pulling away. Oftentimes, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to let them continue. You do not need to participate in it. But if you love them, you're going to have to keep praying for them, and you're going to have to pray for them because they're rejecting your love and the love of the people in their life. And that means they're attached to something that is definitely sinful. And oftentimes people won't talk about that openly. Sometimes it's an affair. I think a lot of times it is because their husband or their wife changes and improves, but then it's just not enough. And then they're like, oh, I'm done. And whether the affair continues or not, whether it's exposed or not, whatever the sin is, this doesn't always have to be an affair. But people become attached with the sin, and then they get attached with the damage it does to the identity. They can't show back up, so they just stay hidden. And so you need to pray for your spouse. If you're married to them and they're in that state, like you have to pray for them. You have to do what pleases God. I know you're in pain, and when you're in pain, you're going to be tempted to selfishness because that's human. You're going to want to find somebody else, or you're going to want to divorce them, or whatever your fears tell you to do. But there will be no consolation if you just do all of this stuff. And so if you're in that place and your spouse is still pulling away and you've done all of these things and you've attempted all of these things, you're going to need to continue to pick the virtue God has asked you to participate in right now and live virtuously and continue to move towards the person that you want to be, regardless of the state of sin that your spouse is in. They're going to continue to drink. They're going to continue with their affair. They're going to continue to push away from you. Again, that's not something that you can control. So it's super important that you learn to detach. Because detachment just means, and I think we've talked about this on one of the most recent podcasts about detachment, is this idea that this person is a gift, and this person is going away. But your happiness, the good news that people need to understand is your happiness in your life, your fulfillment in your life is not about the status of your marriage. Your happiness has to do with the status that you're at in line with the person that you want to be. So if I am not living consistently with the man I want to be right now, I'm going to feel like crap. That's the nature of sin. If I'm not on track with that man, my confidence goes down. Even if people don't believe in God and they're living the life O'Reilly and they're into scientism or they're atheist, whatever, they can't escape. This is just the way that human beings are made. If you're doing things that are inconsistent with who you are, your confidence goes down. If you are consistent with the man or woman you want to be, your confidence goes up because you're not in sin. You're not diminishing your life. You're not diminishing the quality of your life and the decisions you can make and your power, the power of your will. And so we need to be mindful of that, okay? We just need to be, mindful of this, that, happiness is not because of this person. If you're unhappy because of this, yes, you can be upset by it, you can be distressed by it, but you shouldn't be disturbed by it. Because again, you can't control them, you never could control them. And yes, it may take time to accept certain things about your spouse to get to the present moment and to take this constructive action. But it's super important that that's why we look at our fears so that we can accept the reality. Yes, my husband has an alcohol problem. Yes, my wife has had this affair. Okay. And what upsets me about that? And how is it that, what is still good? What are the things that are still good in my life? And what are the things that I can build from? The man I want to be at the end of my life, what would he do in this situation? Not what because other people won't know what to say or what to do most of the time. There are very holy souls out there that maybe you'll run across that can give you good counsel, and that's wonderful. But it's rare. Many of your friends get scandalized and they lose hope when they hear about this. Because when people get divorced, it is both a public scandal and it is a sin against hope. It says, I can't change and you can't change. I can't change and you can't change. And it says that, God can't fix this. God can't fix this. You know what I mean? I hear all the time, I have nothing left to give. Oh, yeah, I get that. I get that. You never had much to give, actually. I don't have much to give. I'm pathetic. But God can do whatever he wants. And so a lot of this self-reliance in marriage, all of us, myself included, hopefully we all don't go to these intense, despairing places. We're going to encounter things that break our self-reliance, that say, okay, this is really hard. Okay, I'm going to have to turn towards God. Or you can just try to Iron John it, try to do it on your own. But it will not end well because you're not God. I don't know if that comes as a surprise to people, but hopefully not. So hopefully this makes sense, at least as a jump off. If you know people that are struggling in their marriage, send them a link to this or send them this podcast so that they can listen to it. Have people really, I would say a lot of people's marriages have been transformed. Just, send them the link to that Hearts Renewed program. People need to know that there's a program out there for Catholic couples so that they can kind of, have the marriage that they really do want and to design it and to do it privately and to do it effectively, whether they do it all on their own or with their spouse at home. But send as much as you can. Communicate these ideas with the people that you care about, because again, we belong to each other. Don't turn a blind eye to people who are struggling in their marriages, because again, their kids might marry your kids someday, and they might be your in-laws. You don't know. You have no idea what God has in store for you. So go out and smuggle some hope wherever you can. And thank you for listening and your continued support of the podcast. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.